Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to the first episode of RJ's Evolution Hour. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce RJ Downard, author of Evolution Slam Dunk and maintainer of the TIP, Troubles in Paradise, a Methodology of Creationism project. He's been a regular on our movie nights, for which we are most thankful. So, with that, RJ, say hello.
Howdy.
Howdy.
Here I am. I'm wearing my glasses. I pardon the fact that it's reflecting light into the screen. So if you think that I've been taken over by transdimensional aliens, yeah, it may be true.
That's okay. It makes you look even more studious. So,
Yes, or pathetically geeky, as the case may be. And I'm aware of the fact that my voice and visuals may not be. Satan, Satan, hello, mortals, has just entered the fray. So
oh my.
Anybody who puts a question in on that thing, I will be happy to jump in on and interact with.
Indeed. Satan is here. I had no idea we'd have such big names joining us.
Yes. I thought, how can he spare time away from the cabinet?
Indeed. And, alrighty. And I believe you recently had I believe you have a new patron, do you not?
Yes, good old Eat Meal, who has been the first one on the board, and I gave him a little extra perk that I recorded his answering machine on his phone message in the voice of HAL 9000 computer from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is a big. He absolutely went oogly boogly over that, so I was happy to apply that. He discovered that I can do a good HAL.
I remember how happy he was when he discovered that. Hey, look, Factard.
Well, it's always been a fun thing. I saw that in the theaters when it originally came out. It was shown here in December of 1968, and I've been it's the most overrated masterpiece ever made.
Indeed. All right, and Brian, howdy, welcome.
Hello, Factard and Brian Stevens. I see you are in the fray. I will continue to point out anybody who puts up a question or anything. I'm perfectly happy to jump in on that. In addition to all the blither blather that we're doing up here on the main talk.
Very good. And with that, I guess we might as well just jump right into it. All right. Basically, I've gathered a few creationist assertions that we all keep hearing, and it is possible that our friend RJ may in fact have good refutation for some of these. You'll admit, RJ, it's at least possible, is it not?
It is. There is a possibility of that. Yes.
Alrighty, and another thing. This is not movie night. There will be no calls for drink, RJ. If I say something stupid, you are not permitted to call drink.
I can say drink on my own though.
Alrighty, all right. Now let's jump right into it. One of the assertions I've heard over and over again is evolution is unscientific because it is not testable or falsifiable. It makes claims about events that were not observed and can never be recreated. And what do you think of that, RJ?
Oh gosh, that was charming if it was 1950, but it's 2017 and heck, we moved on. And there's a charming little term called paleogenomics that immediately jumps to mind. Starting in the 1990s, when they discovered these homeobox genes and all the little nuts and bolts that actually are the business end of how things do complicated stuff, and discovered how universal they were, they began to figure out what mutations are necessary. And if you remember about how the genetic systems are structured, you've got the structural proteins that are generated by the actual DNA, but a lot of DNA relates to what are called regulatory systems. And then there's higher level, these homeobox genes are kind of like the things that deploy the sequencing of regulators that decide when the gene is turned on and off to make the protein. So there's a big hierarchy of stuff. And mutations anywhere along those lines can create wonderful new systems. As they began to pare away and look at the gene codes as more and more organisms got genotyped, they could go, here's two organisms that are not entirely kissing cousins, and they're using similar genetic systems. We can use our evolution theory that's supposedly so untestable and go back and retro-engineer what the ancestral molecule was like and test it out in the organism. And we discover that it's doing the ancestral, not quite this, not quite that function that the evolution theory was predicting for them. You notice how I'm talking about predictions and fulfilled predictions in experiments here? Ha ha, paleogenomics. Over the last 10, 20 years, this has expanded as they move beyond the protein level to more of these cis-regulatory systems. And two things that have just come along in the last couple of years, one of which involves retroengineering the jaw and skeletal structure of birds and their dinosaur ancestors. Bird beaks are formed from a particular little nub on the very front end of a particular bone. And they found that by deactivating the genes that had been modified to make the beak, they retroengineered the archosaur skeletal structure of the ancestor form. The papers on this stuff, you know, this is retroengineering. And then over on the mammal side, we're mammals, remember, teeth structure has been one of the major diagnostic things, because most of the fossil record for mammals are consisting of teeth, because they're the real durable parts. Same way for sharks. Everything else disintegrates because it's cartilage, but the teeth remain. So a lot of species are only known from that. But fortunately, even more than sharks, mammals have really distinctive teeth. And they've got these little crowns, and they look like little nubby bits. And if you look at your own teeth, you can see that kind of stuff. And so you wonder, how does that happen? Well, it turns out they've retroengineered how that happens. And they managed to retro-engineer like 100 million years worth of mammal tooth shape, going all the way back into the reptile-mammal transition. In fact, some of these things are ones from extinct forms that lived during the time of the Mesozoic, offshoots of the mammal lines that no longer exist, but they've been able to retro-engineer their teeth because just they can tweak the couple genes that are involved in the mutations involved. So does this sound like we've moved way beyond the can't test, can't falsify stage?
It does sort of seem that way. I'm starting to doubt their first assertion here.
That they've ever bothered to read these papers. I mentioned both of those incidents, the tooth regeneration stuff and the skull material, in Evolution Slam Dunk, my new book, because they popped up both in relation to dinosaurs and the reptile mammal transition stuff. And the papers are in all in the bibliography, all that. So I encourage everyone to buy my book, and then they can just look in the damned index and find all those sources in the bibliography.
Indeed, it's like ammunition. It's a good thing to
Yeah,
have.
yeah, that no one had put together before in quite this way. And why aren't we doing this more often? Because it's all been out there. Very few anti-evolutionists even bump into that set of data, in part because too many anti-evolutionists are just relying on other anti-evolutionists to tell them what evolution thinks. Always a dangerous thing to do, relying on secondary sources.
Alrighty.
Who needs to be told to drink? I'll drink every time I hear a pause. Oh, well, fortunately, I tend to talk on rather rapidly, Satan. So you may not have a chance there. Should I insert pauses, pregnant, portentous pauses, in order to allow Satan to drink?
Satan, me too. Me too. Your last comment, me too.
Yeah. Well, it's because I've been at this a really long time, and we're also living in a bloody golden age of information. Even 10 years ago, I would have found it very difficult to get the primary source data full text, freebie. And as an impoverished scholar, I really appreciate the freebie part. But now, particularly in the last 5 years or so, it's reached the stage between the major journals and the professors' websites and Academia EDU and ResearchGate. I can get most technical papers free online, full PDF. And that means I can get caught up to speed on this kind of stuff. Whoa. And follow-up tracks. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, if there's one that's really useful to plow through and just check it on a weekly basis, because it's a weekly journal, it's pnas.org. Because that's, first of all, your taxpayer money at work. That's the National Academy of Sciences. And everything on it is free after a year, and a lot of it is free even at the time of advanced publication. So there's an awful lot of that stuff, but it all eventually becomes free. Even better, unlike Science or Nature, their websites where you have to pay to get the meat there. They're part of the Highwire citation system. And so if you look up the abstract of an older paper, you'll see a long string of technical papers within the network that cited it since. So you can get caught up on the technical field just by poking around and going, oh, I didn't know about that paper from 2016 that cited this paper from 2005. Click, boop, more information. And so that's just a wonderment to be able to do that kind of material, to get caught up to speed on primary source data stream that would have been very, very difficult to do years ago. So I'm thorough more than brilliant. I'm methodical.
Well, apparently that method has worked out. All right. I
Ooh,
believe it.
genetically modified crocodile teeth placed in a duck, best yard dog. You can have eats bugs and intruders. Ah, the bugs part is really interesting, Brian, because insectivores play an enormous role in the origin of mammals. In Slam Dunk, I had a whole section on Michael Denton, who's the intelligent design guru, and he decided that he was going to disprove the reptile-mammal transition, not by discussing any of the data, and he didn't even bother citing any sources on it directly. Ain't that gutsy? But he was insisting that the jaw structure, you cannot even imagine an adaptive Darwinian scenario that could explain this as a Darwinian system. Well, a little bit, I hope I can put my fingers up here and you can understand. There's a double jaw. Boy, everything's backwards in doing this kind of thing. Maybe I better do it on this side and make it better. We have a gigantic dentary bone and no other bones behind them, whereas reptiles all have a bunch of extra bones behind, and it's the articular bone in the rear that actually articulates with the quadrate bone up in the skull. And we still have those connections, except we pull them up into the middle ear and we use them for hearing. And this has been known since the 1830s. And Denton, in his smart-ass way, decided to argue that those little itty-bitty bones that are shrinking in the reptile-mammal transition case, in the details that he never bothered to explain, he wasn't denying the facts, but he said that cannot generate the forces to produce that expanding dentary bone in that framework. And he cited one and only one paper for this, which was a paper in Science magazine on the bite force of Tyrannosaurs and crocodiles. And so right off the bat, I realized that he was barking up the wrong tree. First of all, because the reptile-mammal transition are involving the synapsid reptiles, which are ones that have only a single skull hole that eventually becomes our zygomatic arch, that cheekbone that we're used to. And diapsids, the dinosaurs, archosaurs, crocodile bunch, have two skull holes, and there are muscle attachments in there. So it's very different dynamics right off the bat. And secondly, he was falsely assuming that those little itty-bitty bones in the rear were the ones that were driving the expansion of the dentary bone, instead of the dentary bone expanding, pushing the dentary bone. Well, having advantage of getting the full text of the paper, which I could, because one of the authors posted it, I think, on ResearchGate, even though the text itself charged if you got it from Science magazine, I was able to see the whole bloody paper. And it turns out that buried in the source he just cited was all the information I needed to blow his complete argument to smithereens, and it all had to do with insectivores. There was a cute little chart in the thing. Let me see if I can do this so that I'm pointing the right direction. Yeah, I have to do it the other way, like so. Yeah, there was a chart that was up like so, and up on the upper part of where my fingers would be were the bite force size of Tyrannosaurs, and farther down the line was the crocodiles, and then way at the bottom were human beings. And it turns out that the major difference between those forms has to do with the fact that one has bigger jaws than the other. So Tyrannosaurs aren't necessarily a stronger muscle bite force. They're just really big jaws. And that's why they do it as well. Even though we're a synapsid that has just one dentary bone, we have a par for the course, given the size of our jaw, and perfectly normal. On this chart, though, there was a blob of stuff down in the lower corner that didn't fall on the line. And those are the insectivores. They don't have a strong bite force. And because the early mammals are insectivores, they eat bugs for a living, they don't need to have an adaptive line that's leading to a strong bite force, because they don't need that, because they're insectivores. What they do need is something good at eating insects. And if he had followed up on the source that was in the paper he just cited on insectivores, and read the sources in that thing, and this was like 5 minutes mouse clicking, this was really exhausting to do on the computer to find these sources, I discovered that it was something that was staring me in the face from the get-go. If you look at, and another problem Denton does, because he never paid attention to the fossils, he never bothered looking at what they look like. Most of the skeletal things you'll see in the journals will show the side view but a lot of them will show the top-down view, the dorsal view, and that's where the business end comes in. Because this had been staring me in the face for years, and I never realized the implication of what I was looking at until I read this stuff on insectivore bite force that came about because I was tracking down the source that was in Denton that he didn't bother to read. If you look at these early insectivores, Cunotherium and Morganucodon and the like that are in the transition into mammals, they've got a really long, narrow jaw. This dentary bone is just like a pipette. It's ridiculously narrow and thin. And then this big bulge where the skull is, where the zygomatic arch dumps out and these muscle attachments come down, the masseter muscles that we have, that form on the outside of the jaw. That's one of the distinctive features. And I go into all of that in Slam Dunk. But the thing is that dentary bone with those little teeth, there is an adaptive selection pressure, because when the little thing is going eating with its little mouth, it pulls the insect farther back into the dentary bone just by the act of eating. It doesn't require anything special, and it doesn't require anything super duper bite force. But all of this was in the technical papers that had been brought out by following up on the material that was in the paper that he cited inappropriately to get rid of the thing that he didn't want to discuss. Pause for breath, Satan, you can get a drink.
Okay. That's
Did everybody follow that one?
It did, in fact. Alrighty. Yeah, we may have popularized that whole.
Where I not only vaporized Michael Denton on this jaw issue, on the one and only source that he cited, but I ended up learning a hell of a lot more about the dynamics and the history of life and why these reptile-mammal transition critters were doing what they were doing way back when. This was about 200 million years ago. Morganucodon, which is one of the early mammals, is a contemporary to early dinosaurs in the late Triassic. And then the wind-up for that went back another 100 million years, long before even the diapsids got to be big kids on the block. They were minor players compared to our group. I'll just plug a thing. Almost everybody has seen Dimetrodon, which is that little finback reptile that you always see. They use cheap people like Irwin Allen would just take a Gila monster and slap a fin on it and turn it into a Dimetrodon. And that's what they did in Journey to the Center of the Earth too. Is actually one of the air quotes reptiles, the synapsid reptiles that's on our side of the fence. So they're not dinosaurs, they're not diapsids, they're part of that once dominant group. The mammals were developing out of the dominant land animals of the Permian period, and then they got almost completely decimated. I think only one order of therapsids slipped through into the Triassic period, and then the climate was changing, so the increasingly mammalian metabolism of these little fur balls, they had hair, and small insectivores, were starting to be outcompeted by the new dinosaurs that were coming along, and they were driving the other archosaurs into marginal positions. And then by the late Triassic and into the Jurassic, the dinosaurs are the dominant land animals, and the little early mammals are scampering around into the nocturnal environment and squeaking in special ways and enjoying the night for the next 150 million years. And eventually some of them learn to squeak later on after they become bats. Those little insectivore bunch led off to an awful lot of interesting directions. And then once the dinosaurs checked out, then the mammals now were free to run the show again. And they started proliferating in a hurry. And within 10, 15 million years, it developed whales and a whole bunch of other stuff. But that's a compression of the little deep time story into like a 10-second squib.
Hey, if I can interject, Trevor, that's... Yeah. The reason for that, Trevor wants to know why I don't have the DVR option enabled. It is because on the first stream we did, I did not have it enabled, and I never went back in to change it. I see where it would be an excellent idea, and I will do so in the future. Apologize. That would be a good thing to have up.
And heavy hauler, Dimetrodon little fin-backed. I don't think it was little. No, at the time, it was a pretty good-sized predator. It's about the size of a Komodo dragon, long, if memory serves me. And there were various sizes, some of them smaller and some of them bigger. And there were a whole bunch of ones, and some that didn't really have the sphenacodonts, are cousins to Dimetrodon, that didn't have as dominant a fin structure on it. But they were pretty mean predators of the time. Remember, back 220, 230 million years ago, they were one of the larger predators. In the same way that if you look at anomalocaриds, these weird critters back in the Cambrian that are like 3 feet long or so, That was the super monster, the Moby Dick of its time back 500 million years ago. So it's all a matter of scale. It would be relatively small compared to even the earliest bigger predatory dinosaurs that would have been about 8, 10, 12 feet long. I think the Dilophosaurus was about in that range. And then you start getting big allosaurs that are 20, 30 feet long and weigh tons. But Dimetrodon was a fairly lightweight animal, comparable to, roughly comparable to the mass of a crocodile of that size, if memory serves me.
All right, shall we move on to the next creationist assertion? Let's see.
Sure.
Here's a
If you feel I've covered the experimental end of it in paleogenomics adequately.
I believe you have. That's just my opinion, of course, but a valid one, I think. All right. Okay. Here's another assertion here quite commonly. The disagreements among even evolutionary biologists show how little solid science supports evolution.
Yeah, this is a really popular one, and intelligent designers like to use it just as much as full-blown creationists do. They say, see, those guys are disagreeing. And one of the favorite course ones was Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge's Punctuated Equilibrium, Evolution by Jerks, as the joke goes. I have a whole postage on it in tip 1.3 at my website, if anybody wants to go to that. www.tortucan.com and or www.tortucan.wordpress.com if you want the PDFs. Anyway, the big picture is disagrees about what? And if you regard evolution as natural branching common descent, nobody in any of these alleged disagreements is arguing with that. What they're quibbling about are often the role of how adaptive evolutionary processes are. In other words, is everything that happens in the fossil record over the billions of years of life due to things being adaptive, or can things kind of wander along, just the animals getting along, but it's not necessarily serving a direct purpose? How much of things are sexually selected? And how does that work? Is there a level of species selection or not? In other words, can some species have a certain specialized kit bag that makes them as a species or even a genera a little bit more competitive with other ones that are maybe close cousins? And are there any reasons for that kind of stuff? And that's what you get into when you move beyond the old neo-Darwinian synthesis that was worked out in the 1930s before DNA was discovered, before homeobox genes were discovered. And it's because of all this new data that's come downstream that has just caused things to be much more fun and interesting. The discovery of homeobox genes in the 1990s, for example, which means that anybody who tries to make hay about scientific disagreements of stuff that was pre-homeobox genes is kind of relying on dated material. Yawn. Let's look at what things are doing now. And remember, all that new science material and supposed disagreement has allowed those pesky little evolutionists to retro-engineer organisms, and they're working on the things as we speak. Re-paleogenomics, previous discussion.
Okay then. Let's see any.
Ooh.
Okay. Yes.
Let's see. Arguments in evolution. There's another one from Heavy Hitter. Where do turtles fit? Just where do bats fit? No doubts on evolution, though. Oh, both of those are really quite interesting. Turtles came about in the Triassic period, and because they lived in the marine environment, and marine turtles is what everyone was arguing about. Where did the shell come from? And under what circumstance did that happen? Problem with looking at marine critters from the Triassic is there's almost no deposits to look into. Plate subduction has obliterated almost nothing of oceanic deposits predate the Cretaceous. And so you have to look for spots where a piece of land has been pushed up and isolated because of plate movement, and then hope that a fossil has gotten in there. Well, fortunately, the fossil genie is busy enough, and they've actually found more and more fossils over the years that have helped trace out the development of the shell, which apparently forms on one side initially in the early forms. I think it was on the bottom, not the top, and then later the top shell develops. And it's probably, if memory serves me from the latest data, it's something that protects it against predation from critters hitting it in vulnerable soft parts. And also, only recently, in the last 5 or 10 years, have they been able to work out the details of how the shell develops both in terms of the genetic systems and that. So it's always harder to work out all the fiddly bits of an evolutionary process when you don't have all the pieces. And we now have more pieces than we did before. You'll find that the creationists, though, will tend to replay the same old material from decades ago as though it were still applying. Now, bats, that's another fun little section. Also hampered by the fossil preservation issue. They're little itty bitty critters. And even in the old tip work, when I look through, there's like 20, 24 bat families, something like that, of which almost all of them have no fossil record at all or don't go back very far. Simply because they're little itty bitty critters, tiny, lightweight bones. They live in environments where they don't get fossilized very easy. The earliest fossil bats show up about 55 million years ago. The one in Messel, which is one of these fancy schmancy Lagerstätten deposits in Germany that preserve soft parts, is one of the oldest nearly complete bats. And it's already a bat. It can fly. It's got membranes. We can see all of that, and can echolocate. Since then, they found some earlier bats that are getting closer and closer to that KT extinction event. And those also could fly, but don't echolocate. So that means the echolocation system has evolved farther along than the original bat form. But when did the original bat develop? The genetics have long suggested that the the development of bats actually predates the KT extinction, so that they're originating in the dinosaur period. And we don't have any fossils for that. They're hard to find. And the fossil genie may never come through on that, but it would not surprise me at all if they eventually found that the proto-bats are occurring, if not during the late dinosaur period, relatively shortly thereafter. The interesting thing dynamically about bats is, of course, they are nocturnal. And the birds had already developed in the Jurassic period with Archaeopteryx in the bunch. Birds also went through a very long evolutionary process. The full-blown, high-powered sternum that modern birds have that allows them to take off whoop from the thing, or have the kind of musculature and high rev rate that allows a hummingbird to function. Those didn't start out that way. And it was a multi-million-year-long process as you find that developing. But the birds dominate the air. There's 9,000, 10,000 species of birds, and they just basically control that avian environment, that aerial environment, unless it's nocturnal. Very few birds go into the nocturnal niche. Owls are a relatively recent example that they've had to have adaptations to being able to see at night, whereas bats developed that little squeaky mammal sound thing in that nocturnal environment, and they pretty much ruled the roost. So it would be expected that bats, if you can find an earlier fossil record of them, are developing as non-echolocating insectivorous critters that are doing a nocturnal environment. We also know they're going to be quadrupedal. Bats and pterosaurs both immediately show up that they have a quadrupedal ancestor the moment they land on the ground, whereas birds develop from a bipedal ancestor. They have all of that musculature and balancing act down because they inherited it from their dinosaurs. The theropod dinosaurs that birds developed up already knew how to do that just beautifully, thank you. And then the feathers just came along as a little side issue. So I hope that, oh yeah, bats do go back that far. Yeah, it's the Messel deposits, I think about 55 million years ago. And the genetic data, if it goes back into the Cretaceous, it could be 65, 60, 70 million years. So there could very well have been proto-bats flopping around in the same environment as a Triceratops. But we don't have enough fossil data to be able to clarify that.
All right. RJ, if you don't mind, I'm going to take this particular moment for a commercial interruption. Yeah, look at this. He's like, "What the hell are you doing, Si?" Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'm doing. Let's see here. You may have seen this before. I'd like you all to pay special attention to this line at the bottom. What has RJ been doing tonight? Same thing he's been doing as long as we've known him. Giving out valuable information for free. I would very much like if anyone who has the means to do so would consider taking a look, and that link will be in the description when we're done. And really this time, because there's been no calls for drink. Anyway, I hope you'll all forgive that commercial interruption. It was
I'll add a commercial as well. I've also got a GoFundMe.
Oh,
and if they go to my main tip website, there's links to that too. The GoFundMe is another way. So there's two different ways if you have money burning a hole in your pocket to help.
All right, and if anybody's wondering, uh, no, RJ had no idea I was going to pull something that weird in the middle of something like this. But anyway, if you have
Yeah,
means to
shameless
do
plugs
so,
are supposed to be at the end.
well, I'm not. It's not a plug for myself. I can do it whenever I want. All right,
Oh, you sneaky stickler.
I am sneaky that way. Sneaky, sneaky. All right. Shall we? Let's see. No questions in the chat. Let us move on then. All right.
Oh, Triassic Mutant Intellectual Turtles from Brian Stevens. Yes, yeah. Well, I won't go for the intellectual part, but they could easily serve in the current administration without any problem.
At least until they're under investigation. All right.
Yes, yes. Well, that's what they got the shell for, you know.
All right. Here is another.
Darwinian scenario.
Here's another assertion that is. This one we just hear all the time, and it's just a lie. And I suspect the people that are saying it know that it's not true. Evolutionists. What the hell's an evolutionist, by the way? Evolutionists cannot point to any transitional fossils, creatures that are half reptile and half bird, for instance.
Oh boy, yeah, that's a jaw dropper and a rib tickler. Although I will disagree with you. The vast majority of creationists who feel that argument really believe it's true. And you know how they know that? Because they read it at a creationist website that told them that it's true. And so that's as far as it goes. The problem is, and this was one of the big focuses that I developed in the TIP project, was to work out what do anti-evolutionists think a transitional form is supposed to look like. And how would they know it if they spotted it? What would be the criteria for accepting? And it turns out they never think about that. Ever. No counterexamples anywhere. No matter how bright the anti-evolutionist is, they don't conceptualize what a transitional form would look like. They simply will find methods for criticizing whatever transitional forms the evolutionist brings up. So that, of course, evolutionists say Archaeopteryx is a transitional form, Tiktaalik is a transitional form, Australopithecines are transitional forms in our own lineage, and so forth and so on. But the creationists will point out such and so, and this and that, and up, and they will do authority quoting back and forth and find some way to dismiss all of that stuff. I went through an awful lot of creationist literature over the years, and I go into stuff that you can find up at the TIP site on birds and the Cambrian explosion stuff and a lot of other material. And then, of course, I went into the reptile-mammal transition in much more detail in the new slam dunk thing. And what's clear about the criticisms of this thing is how you get that big void in their heads when it comes to that definition thing. The closest you get to it is the crocoduck. Good old Kirk Cameron's crocoduck. We've all seen that little puppy. That's called a chimera. That's called a Photoshop. And if you were to ask Kirk Cameron a methods question, gee, that's an interesting transitional form. Can you name me a paleontologist that claims that's what a transition between birds and reptiles would have looked like? I'm sorry, we already know what it would be. Archaeopteryx is the perfectly fine example. And the reason why Archaeopteryx hit as such a big thing, this came along, Origin of Species had just come out in 1859, and there weren't transitional forms of the kind that we're now used to. But here in 65 or 9, it was in the 1860s when the lithographic limestone in Solnhofen was that they were doing for business purposes, and they've kept on finding these cute little fossils from this once anoxic lake back 150 million years ago. And there was a critter that had feathers, and so was a bird. Or was it? Because it's got a long reptilian tail and reptilian teeth in its reptilian snouts. In fact, so many of there's like 6 or 7 Archaeopteryxes that have been found in that deposit. And all of that species comes from that one deposit. So it's a very, very narrow range on that one. But anyway, some of them where the feather impressions were really faint were originally misclassified as dinosaurs. Why? Because they look a really lot like dinosaurs, because birds come out of dinosaurs. And we found a lot more ones since. If you ask any anti-evolutionist, and I strongly recommend you use this as a technique, anyone who says, oh, there are no transitional forms, you've got to not only know the examples, but you need to be able to say, what would it need to look like to be a transitional? I did this on Archaeopteryx with Jonathan Wells quite a few years back because he was shooting his mouth off that the Archaeopteryx is a bad example of a transitional form. It's just a perfectly normal bird that just happens to have teeth and tails like all perfectly normal birds do. So I had to very cagily ask him, and I cover this in the Free Macroevolutionary Episodes thing that you can find on my website, and then I also reprised it a little bit in Slam Dunk. I asked him, okay, let's assume you're right, and Archaeopteryx is not a good transitional. And what would then be a transitional? Just imagine you had Archaeopteryx standing on your desk and a perfect transitional landed right next to it. And how would you tell the difference between the two? Because remember, you got to be able to have some differences between the two. Otherwise, Archaeopteryx is a perfect transitional. Well, I had to write off to the guy, even though we had an email world. He didn't actually communicate by email and still doesn't, I don't think. Or at least not publicly to other people who want to criticize him. But anyway, I had to physically write to the Discovery Institute with this carefully phrased letter so that he wouldn't circle the wagons and think that I was an anti-creationist. And oh, I'll jump in. Kirk Cameron is a transitional form between an 80s icon and a washed up loon. That's quite true. Oh, good old Soar. That is a fun one. Thank you. Anyway, Wells finally replied to me as a generic question with a perfectly wonderfully predicted answer, because he says, gosh, I've never thought about what a perfect transitional would look like. And I was going, gee, I kind of knew that. But he then went on to say, Archaeopteryx is a bad example of a transitional form. And I could just think, wait a minute, we're trying to get off the Archaeopteryx thing to what a perfect transitional form would be looking like. He would never be able to address that issue because there's no part in his brain, anti-evolutionists don't think about these things, as to what they would accept. They only find ways of dismissing. Now, since then, one of the funny things that I love about the bird transition is everybody forgets what happens after Archaeopteryx, because birds continue their evolutionary line for millions and millions and millions of years. There's a whole bunch now of Cretaceous birds and post-Cretaceous birds. The earliest range of birds are these, and I may or may not be slaughtering the world. It's like a tongue twister for me to remember, the enantinitharines. They're the opposite birds. The little scapula, I think, in the shoulder joint is reversed as to where the ball and socket, which one is the ball and which one's the socket. And that, of course, screams developmental biology switches going deep in bird evolution. And we don't have the fossils to clarify that, and they haven't done a lot of new genetic work on that. But those paleogenomists are out there. Tick, 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 time marches on. Anyway, those were actually the dominant group, not the ornithine bunch that have the socket the opposite way, that the kinds that we find in usual birds. And there's also a bunch that they found since. If you're familiar with a creationist canard Archaeoraptor, that gets popped up a lot, the Piltdown bird is what Jonathan Wells called it. That was a spliced together bird fossil that blew up in the face of National Geographic when they did a whole big splash on it and turned out to be a chimera hoax that people, there's a lot of fossil forgery going on in China because every little town wants its own little museum. And so there's a cottage industry of people faking fossils to sell to them. And this one slipped through the net. Neither science nor nature were willing to publish on this thing. They had their little noses up going, yeah, better watch out about that one. But National Geographic stepped in. Well, it turns out the fossil's way more interesting than the fake, because both of the fossils are legitimate, one of which was a Cretaceous bird, and the other one is this little critter called Microraptor. And since then, we found spectacular fossils of Microraptor. Microraptor is even smaller than Archaeopteryx, and it is interesting because it has feathers on both its front limbs and hind limbs, unlike any other flyer form. And there's enough phylogenetically interesting about its bone structure and the like that suggests that flight was developing in multiple lineages of bird dinosaurs, not just the line, because you've got the enantinitharines that are the opposite birds that are the dominant one. You've got these little Microraptors. There's even one that has a membrane. It's almost bat-like in the sense that it's got feathers, but not on its wings. It's got a little slightly fibrous membrane, more like a bat, that was predicted, by the way, in advance. I allude to that in Slam Dunk. I think Brian Naish called attention to the fact that this one paleontologist had predicted that this particular fossil was going to turn out to be a membrane flyer rather than a conventional one, and that was borne out years later. Anyway, so apparently the paleontologists are really good at anticipating the things in nature, whereas the natural intelligent designers and creationists have their head up their ass and are utterly incapable of predicting anything about the past. Does this not suggest that one side has got the science and the other one not? Eh? So does that kind of answer people's question on the transitional fossil thing? I've kind of gone off and on the birds.
No, I think you covered it. Although I'd avoid the scientific jargon because some people may not be as deep into it as you are. Head up
Oh,
the ass, for
yeah. Well,
example.
anyway, if anyone does on that, yeah. Sometimes I slip into it because it's the easiest way to deal with the thing. The reason why people come up with techno jargon is because it's describing a very specific thing, and I can just jump in. Yeah, predictably, wow, sciencey stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I'm good with the sciencey stuff. I was just making a rather lame joke about the head up the ass comment.
Well, the official term I think is cranial blockage of the rectum, as an old theater buddy of mine described it years ago, and I continue to use that. I think if you want to be more effete.
Indeed. All right. Let us move on to the next one. Let's see. Anything in the chat need responding to? All right. Here we go. RJ, natural selection is based on circular reasoning. The fittest are those who survive, and those who survive are deemed the fittest. That's the assertion, anyway. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful one. And it was the kind of stuff that was very popular in creationist apologetics back in the 1960s and 70s. It's a little less popular today, except among creationists who like quoting 1960s and 1970s creationists. It isn't even one that's used very frequently in the intelligent design movement, but it's built upon a faulty characterization of what selection acts upon. The survival of the fittest phrase was one that was coined by Herbert Spencer, and Alfred Wallace thought it sounded catchy and recommended to Darwin that he make use of it, and so it kind of caught on. And as a trope, it's kind of useful, but if you really want to think about it, it's not necessarily the fittest or even fitter. It's the thing that allows the organism to breed better than its competition. And if you look at it from a gene-centered point of view, which is particularly the way the neo-Darwinists would go, their rather boring definition of evolution is change in allele frequency over time, yawn, which is true, and looked at it in terms of how selection works on it. A mutation occurs, and it changes the allele frequency, and it alters maybe or maybe not the organism's ability to survive. And if it does a little better producing babies, so that those end up surviving, that passes on the gene, and bingo, you've got natural selection at work. And it can't avoid it. Even creationists, in their lucid moments, will acknowledge that natural selection is an observable feature of nature. And we can also test out selection venues, that there's a whole body of effectively applied natural selection, which allows you to look at an organism. Sometimes it's just a yeast virus, a thing, or it can be fruit flies, or you can even view it in an ecological context, where you're looking at how the organism is interacting, and you put in a selection pressure, and you can find that the organism is now moving in a particular and predictable way to a particular direction. And you find the morphology is changing. If you look at, say, the Galapagos finches, as the diet changes, as the kind of seed plants alter, the organism, the little bird, one type of beak form will be selected, and you'll see that kind of beak shape changing over time, and they can measure all of this stuff very, very precisely. So that's just relating to natural selection. But remember, there's another player on the field, which some to this day, in those little discussions between scientists that are supposedly such a big problem, sexual selection. Alfred Wallace hated it. Didn't think it was real at all. It got kind of eclipsed for a long while. It's the idea, with the peacock tail being the obvious example of something that actually is not necessarily very adaptive, but it really turns on the female. So the female wants to have sex with that male, independent of whether or not it makes much sense for the fact that the animal is slowing down, and a leopard might get at your mate more efficiently. That there can be things that can be counter-adaptive, but can be preserved because of that, just because of the sexual selection bit. And there's now that really got a resurgence in the 1970s and 80s, and it's now a major part of modern evolutionary thinking. And I've been following that discipline as well. Not only that, natural selection can preserve something that's actively bad for you if it protects you from something that's even worse. And the classic case here is sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is not a good thing. If you have one side, you can kind of get along okay. If a male and female, you get it from one parent but not the other, so you still have functional blood cells, but another bunch has got the sickle cell mutation that tends to leak potassium, and it produces a problem. This is not good for you if you have two. Both your parents have the allele, and you get that, you're going to have the full-blown anemia, and it's not good. However, it inadvertently protects you from the malaria parasite. That the parasite comes in, and if you have the sickle cell gene, it comes along and tries to reproduce inside of your bloodstream, and it's starving to death because there are so many of these mutated sickle cell things that leak away the very thing that the little parasite needs to survive. Well, the death rate for malaria is way higher than sickle cell in an average population. So it's been sustained as what's called a scorched earth defense in biology, particularly in people who live in malaria environments. And it's popped up independently in various groups. One group in particular, African Americans, got migrated here on boats against their will and are now living in, and their descendants live in an environment that doesn't have high malaria. So now you're only getting the negative effects of the sickle cell, which has a relatively high incidence among Black Americans, as opposed to its functional adaptive quality in the context of a malaria environment. So the notion that survival of the fittest and natural selection is some vague, squishy, self-referential thing. No, no, no. We move way beyond that stage. We've got the genetics. We've got all of that stuff to where we can look at it. We can do things experimentally. You can predict how different gene flows will be altered based upon selection pressures. So you're in a way different environment. And it should be pointed out that the anti-evolutionists don't tend to pay a lot of attention to that technical work. They barely skim 10% of the relevant data stream, as I measure in my TIP project, by the way.
Indeed. And you
Does
said
that
something.
answer that one?
And actually, you said something. There's one word that caught my attention in somewhere near the end of that. You mentioned populations. The folks that I've been hearing this particular assertion from, by just making that specific assertion and the paragraphs they surround it with, it's blatantly obvious that they're thinking of one creature. It must be
Individuals.
exactly. It must be a big,
Evolution
strong
works
creature.
on populations of organisms,
Exactly.
not individuals, even though each genetic packet is being individually mated. So they think, in order for evolution to happen, the same mutation has to pop up simultaneously into male and female, and that they have to somehow find one another. They seem to be clueless that evolution operates in a population. If there's a thing zipping up on the screen that's just passing, the question for RJ when appropriate,
I got
his
it.
observations about the stream of record-breaking Titanosaurs from Argentina. It's been a fun thing. I'm an old fart that dates back to the 1960s when dinosaurs were clunky old things that went extinct because the cute little mammals came along and started eating their eggs. This was the mythology that was coming in the books that I read when I was a kid. And of course, we move way beyond that. The sauropods are just a fascinating bunch. And Titanosaurs and these various groups, the question is, how big do these monstrous sauropods get? How large can they get? The Titanosaurs in particular are kind of a niche end market because the big heyday of the big sauropods was in the Jurassic, and they were a global fauna all over the place. As you moved into the period in the Cretaceous, when the continents are breaking up even more, Pangea has started, the Atlantic was forming, and the South Atlantic is starting to form, and you've got the big Tethys Sea over where India is eventually going to be parked. And so a lot of switches are going on. The climate's becoming a little less conventionally tropical, and all of this plate tectonic maneuvering that's going on is altering some of the sea level patterns and sea level rises and that are doing because of how tectonics is moving stuff around. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in here. But it meant that a new breed of plant eater is emerging that doesn't have the rake approach of the sauropods. And they don't disappear completely, but they become much less dominant. You find the angiosperms plants that are coming along during the Cretaceous require grinding teeth. So you get the hadrosaurs and the Triceratops bunch and all that have a much more shredder approach to teeth angling, because they got to eat this stuff that's got the consistency of celery to it, rather than just something you rake off. Sauropods, in places where you still have the kind of plant material, particularly these tall trees where these large animals can have their things in there, their necks can just plop, plop, plop. South America was still a refugia, and it was still relatively isolated. It had separated from Africa by this time, and was not, the Isthmus of Panama hadn't formed, so it was often disconnected from faunal interchange. So organisms that would be coming in from Asia, where there was a lot of faunal interchange, that's where the ancestors of the Triceratops comes from, is from Asia. And a lot of the plant material passes back and forth. But you have much more isolation down there, in the same way that Australia is an isolated area later on with the marsupials and all of that, and specialized trees end up down there that went extinct everywhere else. So you got these animals that we know that the sauropods in general have got a really great gut microbiome, and they also have like gastroliths with their stones in their tummies that help chew up stuff. So basically, they're this giant fermentation vat of food where they rake the material, it gets down the long neck, drops into the stomach, and it churns around in there. And they don't necessarily have to move around a hell of a lot. They can just move the big long neck around and rake, 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 rake. And especially if they're able to rake at a higher level than any of the other herbivores that are working around at the time, that are smaller quadrupeds. So how big can you get with this? Oxygen levels were somewhat higher, and there's some argument then that you've got a little bit more bang for the buck. Dinosaurs in general seem to have a bit higher metabolism. We know on the theropod line that leads off to birds, birds have a higher metabolism than mammals do by a long shot. So they're presumably able to get more kick out of a somewhat higher oxygen level that way. The sauropods, in fact, the latest taxonomy that's been put up tends to put the whole sauropod line on a separate branch that diverged from the early dinosaurs separately from the theropods. So the old view that Saurischian theropods and Saurischian sauropods are actually fairly close cousins has changed dramatically as a basis of this new data. And I won't go into Herrerasaurs and all the other little bit, because that's almost really for another lecture. And we're almost out to the end of our hour. But the short form is that it looks like the largest forms of these animals can start getting into the 50, 60, 70 ton range. If you are familiar with the brachiosaurs that were in Jurassic Park, that's in that kind of a range. You're running up in the upper limits of how big the bones need to be to support that amount of weight. There's still a fascinating side debate as to how sauropods did sex. How exactly did they rear up and mount from the rear when you've got an animal that's as big as a bus? And what do you do with the tail and all of these other things? One thing that's interesting is the rearing aspect. The older Jurassic era diplodocids and the later called Brontosaurus, but now called Apatosaurus, tended to have relatively high vertebral spines along their back. And there's some good argument that that was allowing muscle attachments to rear the animal up. And in fact, the famous sauropod that's shown in the Museum of Natural History there, I guess in New York, as a very spectacular reared sauropod looming up. And the idea that that was maybe some of the defensive postures that it could do. It could use its tail as a resting medium and become like a tripod and rear itself up to frighten. And they've got claws on the front paws and all that kind of stuff. Well, you're in a little different situation with the Titanosaurs by then. They tend not, and the Brachiosaurs didn't either, they don't have these very tall vertebral spines along their pelvis. And that suggests that they weren't rearers. So these are animals that are plogging along. They're in a niche environment in South America in particular, where they're able to eat the plants that nobody else can get at. They can get quite massive. There's a certain advantage if you get big enough that it's very difficult for critters to attack you. Smaller titanosaurs, you could go after if you have velociraptor types, Deinonychus and all that bunch, but Faunal interchange matters again. I don't think any of those critters that are known in North America, like Utah raptor and that, are known in the South America. I could be wrong on that one, but they weren't able to make that. So if you don't have those kind of sickle cell predators that can use pack hunting to go after a large sauropod, that's another reason why you can have such monster sauropods. So, gosh, does that kind of help explain some of the things?
I remember there's a little lag in the chat, so we'll we shall see if
Mhm.
that covered it. Actually, in the
And then
meantime,
heavy hitter, heavy hauler has got one ran into his epigenetic changes cause evolution. They're passed about or temporary. Not to forget, consciousness can cause epigenetic changes that are passed on and cause evolution. Epigenetics is a whole interesting subject matter. And I've got a section on it with a lot of the current technical literature alluded to in tip 1.4, which is on Darwin's theory. And if you can poke around it at either one of the websites, there's versions on it. The intelligent design set in particular likes to make a big deal that epigenetics is non-Darwinian and refutes this evolution notion. Bull pucky. And you'll find a lot of the technical references in there. You can follow up on a lot of that. A lot of it's available full text. And that's a subject for another day, I think.
alrighty. Um, oh, you know what? Just to throw to our last, before we addressed those two issues with the circular reasoning of natural selection, how we mentioned they're thinking individuals, not populations. I just wanted to add to that, and not thinking of populations evolving is where we get the argument that we couldn't have morality without a supreme authority of some sort, whereas evolving as a community, you would that community would naturally thrive better if they develop social
Oh,
behavior,
yeah, yeah.
empathy, and morality, and
And
things
again,
like
there's
that.
a colossal technical literature on this, on direct and indirect reciprocity. There's a wonderful book called Super Cooperators by Martin Novak and another co-author, and you'll find it in my bibliography knocking around somewhere. As a general notion, the whole evolution of morality stuff has a huge technical literature, including neuroscience data, and anti-evolutionists pay zero attention to it. I mean, zero. It just doesn't pop up on their scope. I'll give a little comment on here. Heavy hauler about they laid eggs right. Hard to imagine the really big sauropod squatting to lay maybe made mounds. Actually, there are sauropod egg nests. There are the ones that definitely made egg nests were the hadrosaurs, but they're relatively smaller animals. I think the sauropods did, if memory serves me, the nests that have popped up are ones that they form in clusters. They're not necessarily on mounds. And that brings up another interesting question, because all dinosaurs laid eggs. To what extent there were thermal factors? Because we know that crocodiles incubate as to what sex they are, depending upon the temperature. And the crocodiles will very carefully manage. Some of the bird things require very precise temperature management. At one temperature, they get male versus female and all that kind of stuff. So we can assume that some of that may have been going on in the sauropods. The eggs, if memory serves me, the sauropod eggs that have been found are roughly the size of an ostrich egg. So given how big the animal is that pops out of it eventually, they start out relatively small.
Alrighty.
Oh yeah,
Um,
Novak is a sharp cookie. He's all over the place. Yeah, that I will agree, Brian. I've got oodles of Martin Novak stuff in the reference bibliography. And he does stuff on origin of language. He's got, of course, indirect and direct reciprocity, that evolution of altruism. It's all over the place. Even done some things where it gets into some controversial areas with some of the collaborations he's done with E.O. Wilson on this levels of selection issue. And to what extent kin selection functions. That's yet another subject matter that pops up in this point. And in this one where you can get into very deep doo-doo if you do not follow the technical literature closely.
all right. Oh my! Look at the time. We do seem to have eaten up the
Yeah, I
entire.
chewed up an hour. I
I
hope
had.
it wasn't dull.
You know what? Why don't I read? Why don't I read the last question that we had as a spit, but it's probably going to take up an entire another show. And I'll read it, and I know that when I'm done reading it, everybody watching is going to scream out just two words. And okay, question number 5, which we will address in the future, is living things have fantastically intricate features at the anatomical, cellular, and molecular level. that could not function if they were any less complex or sophisticated. The only prudent conclusion is that they are the products of intelligent design, not evolution. Now, hopefully,
Irreducible complexity.
okay, I suspect everybody in the audience yelled that out and possibly punched their computer screen. But anyway, that's a big one.
Yeah,
We'll save that.
yeah,
Uh,
that is a gigantic subject matter, and of course, there you're knee deep in Michael Behe and Douglas Axe and Ann Gager and all the little bunch. It's a lead point from intelligent design, although the components of it have been knocking around in the creation science venue for quite some time. But Michael Behe is the guy that really put it onto the front burner,
in,
and it's one that the more you study the little fiddly bit details, although it seems at first glance like the intelligent designers might have half a leg to stand on, as soon as you start looking at the details, you discover, no, things are still looking really evolutionary down there.
Alrighty. Well, very good. And Sewer, absolutely. I know
Thank you, Sewer Tape.
I know RJ is happy to as always, distribute information for free, and we
I've
do all
got one
appreciate
big
it.
section on, I call it Creationism Light, which is chapter 4 of the old tip book, and you'll find the whole PDF up there. I go into an awful lot of Michael Behe stuff and also stuff on whales because he ventured into that quagmire without realizing it. It is from 2004, though, and there's been a lot of water under the bridge since, but it will get a lot of the ideas about some of the philosophical and technical information. And you'll learn a lot about ALU genes in chapter 4, which is something everybody needs to know about ALU pseudogenes to bang over the head of creationists with it.
All right. Well, to wrap it up, yep, you guessed it. You're going to see it one more time, and everybody,
We need to have a catchy tune.
we do something akin to the. You know what? For the next one, I will come up with something that seems to suit the mood. But
Yeah, we can play around with some stuff in here. You see, my tendency would be to pick classical music, but I think that's the kiss of death. So I think, if you pick some pop stuff, that would make much better sense.
we'll see. We'll see. What we find something we agree
We
on
don't want to
there.
scare everybody off with Charles Ives or Mahler.
Uh, but all right. Well, RJ, I would like to thank you for being here for everybody, and once again, just giving out information, greatly appreciated, and thank you.
We live in a golden age of science and stupidity, and it's our duty to try to stay on the science side and make a point of poking things at the stupid side because our civilization depends on it.
I would agree. All right. Thank you everybody for joining us. As always, we appreciate you coming and bringing your questions and all like that. Couldn't do it without you. And RJ, great show. Great show. Look forward to the
Thank you for
next
a
one.
lot of really great questions. There was as much coming in from the questioner's point of view as the stuff that was on the table there. So, and I hope I answered those intelligently.
Indeed. All right. That being it, thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you next time.